Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on stamped paper, printed resistance, and learning to say no together. The core question is this: when does resistance to imperial law become legitimate politics rather than punishable disorder? The core competency is to discuss the development of democratic institutions and the emergence of a common colonial identity after the French and Indian War. When does resistance to imperial law become legitimate politics rather than punishable disorder? When does resistance become legitimate politics rather than disorder? That question sits at the center of the 1760s because colonial protest did not begin as a polished demand for separation. It began through printed complaint, merchant coordination, legal argument, assembly resolutions, and crowd action aimed at imperial policy inside the empire. The period is often compressed into one line about taxation without representation. The line carries force, but it hides the machinery. Someone had to print the argument, circulate the argument, sign the petitions, enforce the boycott, and transform local anger into a shared constitutional language. The Stamp Act crisis is decisive because it touched ordinary routine. A tax on paper does not sound dramatic until the affected paper is listed. Newspapers, pamphlets, court filings, shipping manifests, licenses, wills, contracts, college diplomas, and commercial records. Stamped paper sat where legal life and business life met. Parliament therefore chose a revenue device that could reach merchants, lawyers, printers, ship captains, and ordinary colonists trying to use courts or record transactions. That practical reach created the civic problem. Did imperial legality justify a tax that entered daily colonial life without colonial representation in Parliament? Or did colonists cross a dangerous line when they answered law with boycotts, intimidation, and crowd pressure? The answer depends on how we think legitimacy works. A government can claim authority through statute. A population can still judge that statute as a breach of consent. When those two judgments split apart, political life becomes unstable quickly. The Stamp Act did not land in a silent political world. Colonists already knew how to argue in print. The John Peter Zenger trial in 1735 had left an important political memory. Zenger, a New York printer, published criticisms of Governor William Cosby and faced charges of seditious libel. His acquittal did not create modern free speech doctrine, yet it taught colonists something useful. Public criticism of officials could be defended as a check on bad government rather than dismissed as simple disorder. That memory gained force because print culture expanded across the colonies. Newspapers connected ports, taverns, postwriters, coffee houses, and reading circles. Printers reprinted essays from other cities, copied speeches from assemblies, and turned local disputes into intercolonial conversation. A pamphlet could travel farther than a speech. A reprinted essay could give distant readers a common vocabulary. Print, therefore, worked as infrastructure long before it worked as patriotic mythology. OpenStax also makes clear that imperial reform did not begin with the Stamp Act alone. The Sugar Act of 1764 tightened customs enforcement and revised duties on molasses and related trade. Admiralty courts gained greater weight because smuggling cases could bypass local juries. British officials wanted revenue and more reliable enforcement. Colonists saw a pattern emerging. The empire that had once tolerated looser administration now wanted closer fiscal supervision. That context is decisive because the Stamp Act then moved from trade duties at the edge of commerce to paperwork at the center of ordinary life. Grenville and Parliament chose stamped paper because it looked broad, regular, and administratively efficient. Revenue could be extracted through printed material already required for legal and commercial routine. The design reveals a lot about how imperial administrators thought. If the goal is predictable revenue, tax the documents people cannot easily avoid. Colonists recognized the same logic immediately. The issue was never only price, the issue was reach. A customs duty might sit at the harbor. A stamp duty entered the courthouse, the counting house, the print shop, and the household record. It placed Parliament inside transactions that colonists regarded as part of their internal life. The court system made that reach sharper. Admiralty courts already worried many colonists because they reduced the role of local juries and trade enforcement. The Stamp Act carried a similar administrative message into ordinary paperwork. If a colonist needed stamped paper to sue, probate an estate, record a deed, publish a newspaper, or clear a vessel, then the empire had inserted itself into the procedures that made civil society function. The difference between a duty paid at a customs house and a tax that sits inside nearly every formal document must remain clear. The actors in this crisis wanted different outcomes, and they all felt pressure. British ministers wanted money and firmer control. The 7 Years' War had produced debt, and imperial officials believed the colonies should help bear the cost of defense and administration. They did not see the Stamp Act as arbitrary theater. They saw it as a rational fiscal measure aimed at subjects who had benefited from imperial victory. Colonial assemblies saw something else. They had long exercised authority over internal taxation and local appropriations. A parliament across the Atlantic now claimed power to tax daily colonial transactions without colonial representatives seated in that legislature. Assembly leaders therefore treated the act as a constitutional problem rather than a budget complaint alone. Printers had a special stake because their trade moved arguments into public space. Taxing newspapers and pamphlets raised costs, but it also symbolized oversight of the very medium through which opposition spread. Lawyers and court officers felt pressure because stamped paper touched filings, licenses, and legal procedure. Merchants felt pressure because they sat inside credit networks and import chains that could either absorb policy or weaponize it through collective refusal. The Sons of Liberty translated those scattered pressures into visible resistance. Crowds hanged effigies, pressured stamp distributors to resign, and policed political loyalty in the streets. The crowd should not be romanticized automatically. Public intimidation can slide into coercion quickly. Yet the movement also did something disciplined. It made officials fear enforcement failure. A tax law without local executors and without public compliance becomes hard to sustain. Non-importation agreements reveal the same discipline from the commercial side. Boycotts required planning, notices, merchant cooperation, and community monitoring. Refusing British goods was not spontaneous emotion. It was organized economic pressure aimed at British exporters, colonial importers, and the wider imperial discussion. A merchant who broke the agreement risked reputation, business ties, and political backlash. Committees of correspondence later extended the system. Information no longer stayed local. Letters, newspapers, and committee statements connected towns and colonies. Shared procedure produced shared identity. Colonists did not wake up one morning as one people. They learned to act like one people through repeated communication and repeated resistance. Stamp distributors also belong in the story because they reveal the enforcement bottleneck. Parliament could pass a law in London. The law still required named men in the colonies to receive stamped paper, issue it, and stand publicly with imperial policy. Protesters understood that weakness. Effigies, public shaming, threats to property, and organized demonstrations pushed several distributors to resign. Once distributors withdrew, enforcement suffered before the tax had fully settled into routine. A revenue system can look orderly in statute and collapse quickly if no one will operate the local machinery. The Stamp Act Congress resolutions of 1765 work best when read as constitutional argument inside the empire. Delegates insisted that it is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people that taxes not be imposed without consent given personally or through representatives. They also claimed that colonists were entitled to all the inherent rights and liberties of his natural-born subjects within the British realm. Those lines reveal the pressure because they reveal a political stage before independence. The delegates did not begin by rejecting British identity. They appealed to it. They argued that if colonists remained British subjects, then British constitutional principles should protect them from parliamentary taxation without representation. This was not yet a call to leave the empire. It was a demand that the empire recognize limits. That creates the core tension in the source. The resolutions combine loyalty language and defiance. Colonists still invoke the king and inherited rights, yet they also deny Parliament's claim to tax them internally. The document therefore sits at the hinge point where grievance becomes structure. It turns local protest into a formal intercolonial constitutional claim. The resolutions fuse principle and logistics without separating them. The principle was consent. The logistics were paper, printing, contracts, customs, and enforcement. If the act had applied only to a distant luxury good, resistance might have remained narrower. Because it touched the legal commercial bloodstream of colonial society, the constitutional argument found immediate daily evidence. The document tests the boundaries of legitimacy. Parliament could say it had sovereign authority across the empire. Colonists could answer that sovereignty without representation violated the inherited rights Parliament itself claimed to defend. That is how constitutional conflict deepens. Both sides speak the language of law. They attach law to different institutions. The Congress itself also worked as a procedural event. Delegates from several colonies met, debated, drafted, and petitioned together. That action did not create an independent national legislature, yet it gave the colonies practice in joint political expression. They were learning how to speak collectively before they had decided to separate collectively. The form of the meeting nearly matched the content of its resolutions and political force. The lasting consequence of the Stamp Act crisis was rehearsal. Colonists practiced intercolonial politics before they embraced intercolonial independence. They learned that printed argument could move faster than local rumor. They learned that assembly resolutions could reinforce crowd action rather than simply condemn it. They learned that merchants could convert markets into leverage and that committees could turn information into coordination. That is decisive because common identity rarely arrives through feeling alone. It grows through repeated procedure. A Boston printer, a New York lawyer, a Philadelphia merchant, and a Virginia legislator did not share the same local world. They came to share a constitutional dispute because newspapers, writers, petitions, committees, and congresses taught them to repeat and recognize the same argument. The crisis also left a harder question behind. If public resistance succeeds through intimidation, boycott, and street action, where are the limits? A people defending consent may still use coercive methods. A crowd can protect liberty in one moment and narrow liberty in the next. That tension cannot be dodged. It belongs inside the making of American political culture. At the same time, Parliament learned that a revenue policy imposed from above could fail from below when local society refused to carry it. Stamp distributors resigned. Enforcement wobbled. British merchants complained about lost trade when non-importation cut orders. Repeal came in 1766, but repeal did not restore the older imperial relationship. Colonists had now tested a method. Constitutional language joined to economic pressure and public organization. The closing judgment should remain sharp. Protest became durable when it fused ideas and administration. Printers spread the language, merchants organized the boycott. Assemblies framed the legal claim. Crowds raised the immediate cost of enforcement. Committees and congresses linked separate colonies into one political rhythm. Once those habits existed, later crises would not start from zero. That is why the Act belongs in a lecture about common identity. The colonies did not become common because they forgot their differences. They became common because a tax on paper taught them how to coordinate across those differences. The new identity came through argument, paperwork, circulation, and risk. Rebellion first had to become organized before it could become declared. The limits of the moment must also remain visible. Many colonists still wanted restoration rather than revolution. They hoped repeal and recognition of local rights would repair the imperial relationship. Enslaved people, women, laborers, and native peoples experienced the crisis through structures they did not control fully, even while the rhetoric of liberty spread loudly around them. Common identity expanded through the Stamp Act crisis, yet it expanded inside a colonial society already marked by hierarchy. That contradiction would travel forward with the movement. One more layer belongs in the final judgment. The repeal of the Stamp Act showed that organized resistance could work, which gave future protesters a powerful lesson. The Declaratory Act, passed alongside repeal, showed that Parliament still claimed authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That combination fixed the next conflict. Colonists won immediate relief and inherited a larger unresolved question about sovereignty. The empire retreated tactically without settling the constitutional dispute. The repeal of the Stamp Act settled the immediate tax, but not the constitutional conflict. The harder judgment is what a political community should do when defense of consent starts relying on intimidation, boycott, discipline, and crowd pressure. That tension remained inside the language of liberty as resistance moved forward.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.